Hi, I'm Nick Jakoviak, and this is my second humanoids assignment. This topic is computer vision, and I opted to attempt the 3D rotational matrix. I'm going to run the program now, but it takes a minute because some of the calculations have a lot of steps. I use several helper functions, which the program basically goes through in sequence. As you can see here, this doesn't really look very much like the initial image given to us. I'm displaying this image along with the correct, hopefully correct rotation matrix on the bottom. And what I'm trying to show with this image is that I calculated the various stages by actually storing my data in the red, green, and blue values of the image itself. This makes debugging easier, and it also allows other people to see what each step of the program does. This is the end result, and I'm going to explain what all of these colors mean in a minute. The first step for me was finding the actual borders of the block, which proved to be one of the hardest tasks in the entire assignment. First, I tried just using the highest red values because the block is much more red than anything else in the image. But I found that this didn't work in situations where there were shadows on the block and on some of the ones where it was away from the light. Instead, I used contrast, checking again on the red values, but just making sure if there was a large jump in the red value from one pixel to another, it would highlight that area. If I go to this step and I insert the image step there, run the program again, you'll be able to see that the picture highlights only the areas that have a large jump in red value. After that, you can see that there's a ton of noise still on the image. Everything that has any kind of change in red is basically picked up at this stage. This step is one of the easiest to explain, but probably the hardest to actually execute. Through this, I went through every pixel, and if it was one of the highlighted ones, I checked how many pixels there were continuously. I stored each of these in its own array, and then I picked the largest one and highlighted only that one. This works because the block is the largest object in the image with very distinct boundaries. If there were other huge images or huge objects in the image of any shape, it might throw off the program, but at that point it would be really more like facial recognition than simply orientation, so that was a different challenge. After this step, there's still some noise attached to the image. Anything that was basically touching the block or directly underneath it also gets picked up by this test. So next, I filled it in, and I used this based on the average value of the border because for a rectangle that's always inside the rectangle. And after this step, you can see it's starting to look a lot more like the final result. This is all ultimately so I can use the surfaces for calculations. And here, everything in light green is the inside of this shape. The next step is actually the last one that directly modifies the image I'm showing. It's called a depth gradient. I used MATLAB's built-in gradient function to find the change in depth of the surface. This is the first time I actually used the depth map given to us on the assignment. And as you can see, it looks pretty much like that one I showed you at the very beginning. What I did was, looking only at this block area, the red in this image is anything that was chosen by the flood fill, by the fill border program on the last one, and as you can see, every pixel here has got that 151 red value. That means it's just inside the shape. Anything that has a 254 green value was chosen because it has a very high uh, gradient, which means as you move upwards and to the right, the the change in depth will increase. And anything in gray, which is a red value of 128, is the opposite. It's decreasing as you go along the shape. And because you can split the shape into two areas like this, it allows you to pick some points on each of these surfaces and know that you're on the correct part of the image. Once I had that, it was basically just math from here. I uh, I averaged 50 values because sometimes the image was a bit noisy, even with all of these adjustments. I think part of the problem was that the depth image itself was noisy, and another issue is that the gradient function doesn't always seem to do what I want it to. The next step is I choose 3 points on each of the surfaces, make 2 vectors out of them, and then cross them. And this gives you the normal vector to the shape. Once you have 2 normal vectors, you can cross them together and get the third vector because it's a rectangle and all of the angles are perpendicular. What does change though is that if the shape, for example this one, does not have 2 visible surfaces, one of the earlier functions detects this and it instead uses some 2D calculations to get that one. So for instance here, you could see a bunch of gray pixels, meaning that the gradient is decreasing, and you don't see any green ones. So one of the vectors comes from that, the gray pixels, and the other 2 I get from I call them 2D calculations, which is basically just finding the maximum and minimum x and y values and then making lines out of those. This is an okay approximation because if you can only see one surface, that means the image isn't very rotated, so it's almost flat. In the case of a 2D vector, a 2D shape, I can fairly easily determine whether it's oriented correctly or not after these calculations. And by calculated correctly, I mean whether these rows are actually in the correct order. However, for 3D, I am a little bit lost. So the 3D numbers should be correct, but their order in the matrix may not be. This is mostly just because I'm not completely confident in my ability to reason around the rotation matrices. However, in terms of unit vectors, these results should be as accurate as they can get. The only situations where there are errors should be where the gradient isn't working properly, and that would be reflected by the final image output. And that's my program. Thanks.